Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing. And we are currently in chapter 50, not 50, 64, excuse me. We're not going back in time. All right, let's go ahead and we'll jump in. We're going to, for most of the passage, be looking at the Feng English translation. And then for the final portion, we're actually going to use a translation from Red Pine. That's a pen name. I don't remember off the top of my head what his actual name is, but he's a very well-known scholar in the field. And it starts with a very controversial line to my thinking. It says, "Peace is easily maintained." Um, Now, this is translated in a couple of different ways. The actual concept behind this idea of peace is stillness or calmness. Peace obviously brings in more of a political overtone as opposed to simply, something being calm. And I think that's because, as we've seen, there's a lot of focus on the aspect of how is a culture governed, society governed, and that's going to come into play here as well. And so I think this is a legitimate way of thinking about this line, but it certainly is easily questioned. It seems as though peace is one of the more elusive things. And maybe that's because we're trying to attain it rather than maintain it. But it seems even in groups that start off and it seems like they are at peace or harmony with one another can easily devolve. And so this one gives me a lot of, caused me a lot of thinking in this chapter. And I actually end up really appreciating this chapter after really wrestling with this. But I want to start with getting some thoughts on what you think about this initial idea that peace is easily maintained. Does that sound right to you, or what do you think they're trying to get at with that?
It depends on the scope, I think. Peace within yourself, peace within a community, peace within a country, peace within the world.
Yeah. So imagine, again, we're thinking the context of the Warring States period, right? Where this
Yeah,
is particularly ironic. Um, and so we're thinking about smaller kind of villages, maybe initially, but then also how they group together into larger confederations. The idea that peace would be easily maintained.
Peace is easy to maintain, just don't go to war.
But how do you stop from going to war, right? This is my I mean, this one really just stopped me in my tracks, even at this first line, because I love the idea. I definitely come from more of a kind of a social justice, I guess you could say, kind of orientation, but also had a strong nonviolence focus for many years, which maybe sounds strange with our prior conversation about Kung Fu, but that's actually one of the things that caused me to stop participating in that over 20 years ago. But the idea of maintaining peace, I definitely am a fan of, but the question is how, and it seems so difficult. I've also been involved in a lot of different, like just social community type situations that very easily fracture. So I was intrigued by this idea that somehow they're saying that this is actually an easy thing to do. And I guess, I didn't hear a whole lot about if you think that this actually rings true, but if you were going to try and do this, how would you how would you maintain the peace?
that's a really hard question.
I mean, you could take it to something that's small. Let's say you had a group of 10 friends that got together every week to play cards or something or play a board game. Um, many of us have had different groups like this, and they sometimes will kind of fracture. Somebody will get their feelings hurt, or things will kind of devolve.
I actually
And
do this, and we've been doing it for like the last 3 years. So I guess in this context, I can relate. Um,
so, how do
yeah,
you maintain the peace?
we just communicate, and if there's a problem, we just say it and we find a solution together that works for everyone. I don't know, we're just really open. We don't really, and because of that, we don't end up with a lot of issues.
Do you think that there's a mutual desire to maintain the peace, so to speak? I mean, I'm sure that's not like the
Yeah.
stated goal that we want to not fight with each other, but
Yeah, I think because we all want to be there, we enjoy doing those things, like we want to make sure that everything is running smoothly.
yeah.
Like we're all invested. We all care. So I think like when you start to have people that don't really want to be there, or they start to not care or withdraw, that's when problems can start to happen.
And it can be even a little bit different in the sense that you're just a group of friends, and if somebody decides, I just don't like playing this game anymore, they can simply stop attending. But imagine there was nowhere else to go, right? That if you take it to like a country or a citizenship, and you can't actually leave, and you're kind of born into it, right? Then what if somebody isn't happy playing Pokemon or whatever the game is that you're playing, and they want to do something different, but everybody else doesn't, right? It becomes a little bit more complicated in situations where leaving isn't really an option. Anybody else have some thoughts on that?
It makes me think of um like shows like Survivor where you get like voted off the island or whatever, you know.
Yeah, that's definitely a little bit more of a competitive approach. Well, let's just kind of tease this out a little bit. In different areas that I've been involved in the past, have really worked hard in terms of developing certain groups and maintaining certain groups. And it is not easy, especially if you're not going to come from more of a controlling perspective, which obviously we've seen over and over again. The Tao Te Ching says you can't force it. You can't bring your own agenda and try and make it happen. So how from a governing perspective would you actually foster a community in which peace is something that's easy to maintain? And so this is just kind of my general thought on how I think they're approaching it in this chapter, even though it's mostly kind of understated. But a it's a vibe, I guess you could say, that I pick up from more of the text as a whole. But it seems like the approach is that that in order to do that, you have to create the desire for the way of being that leads to peace. So when you were talking about your group, Taylor, you said that everybody wants to be there, so they're motivated to, work out problems and obligations and that kind of thing. So I think if you're trying to deal with any type of social uh, process without using coercion, then it boils down to the idea of how does it become something that people want? We all ultimately are motivated by the things that we love. If there's something that we love, nobody has to encourage us to do it. Nobody has to force us to do it. It's something that we do because we want to do it. And ultimately, if we're going to have a community that is really able to maintain peace, then you have to have created, in a sense, that vision of what that community looks like in such a way that people can see that and internalize it as let's say, the good life that they want, and then they are internally motivated to participate in the things that are necessary to bring that about. So it's a lot about casting a vision and developing in people a desire, a love for something that's going to become that internal mechanism for how people are motivated to want to be a part of it or to participate in it. But the challenge with something like that is, of course, not everybody has the same tastes. And so how do you help people understand that? I think when you're in a situation like the Warring States period, you've got a strong contrast, and you can look at all of the chaos and the suffering that people are experiencing, and you can present a different picture of this is what things could be like. That can be very powerful. But if you're in a situation where you've had relative peace for a long time, it can be a lot harder for people to have any kind of understanding of what the opposite would look like. And this is kind of like a cyclical problem, right? Because let's say you're going through a major crisis and everybody can see and be motivated to come to a resolution because they see what that suffering brings and they can see the benefit of this alternate way of doing things. But then once they hit a couple generations of things going well, you've got the young kids thinking, I could do this different, or I don't like having to focus on it this way, or what's wrong with, this other way of doing things. And you have to essentially kind of end up with another situation that becomes awful enough for people to recognize they need to do things a particular way. And I think this is a common thing we've noticed is how accurately the challenges that they're describing, 2,500 years ago or so, seem to be the same problems that we're still dealing with. And maybe this is the cause that we are it's hard for us as individuals to maintain that collective knowledge of what things were like before in order to maintain the way things are, or that the vision gets corrupted or gets lost, or maybe from a top-down perspective, things start to devolve because, again, the initial vision, the reason, the motivation has been lost. Any thoughts on that?
Seems like it maybe relates to the hard times create strong men idea.
Mm. Yeah, there's a motivation that happens when you're confronted with something that's really not good, right? And it's hard to maintain that same level of commitment once things have been good for a while.
Right, because hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times.
Yeah, exactly.
What about strong women?
The quote is obviously from a long time ago.
Yeah.
We'll have to update that.
Strong women make good sandwiches.
Yeah, that one's still old, I would say. We'll still have to update.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a unique challenge that we have. So, I think about this a lot because I have, personal desires for types of communities that are focused on these types of things. But at different times, it's very hard to find people that are actually interested in them because they're either caught up in things being too busy, simply just trying to survive in a culture that makes it a little bit tricky to figure out how to, keep the roof over your head. And other times it's because things are going relatively well and they're like, I don't have to worry about anything. So it's challenging because there's definitely something in our human nature that is willing to not have to focus on some of these deeper concerns, let's say, when it seems like things are going relatively easy. So this chapter then is going to dive into some aspects of that that are going to deal with different challenges for how we go about maintaining that peace. It doesn't get as much into how do you create that collective vision for, desiring that way of life. I think it's something that's a little bit more taken for granted, but it's kind of underlies the whole premise of non-coercively working with people, right? It's not by trying to, you know, again, that carved wood versus the uncarved wood. It's embracing what is, but also painting that vision of what can be when things are in harmony with Tao, that is creating that motivation for, the students of Tao to want to follow that way. It's a way of generating that desire or that love for a particular way of life that is engendering the motivation. So it continues by picking up a theme that we saw in the last chapter. A couple of statements here that are very much like what we just saw. Trouble is easily overcome before it starts. The brittle is easily shattered, and the small is easily scattered. So these would be statements very similar to what we saw last week, where there's an emphasis on, tackle problems while they're still little. It's much easier to manage them at that point and to not lose focus on the details or on the attention. So we have a similar start where there's, again, let's remember to stay focused on the details and remember that the small things matter and it's easier to deal with them while they're still small. And then we get a couple of lines. The first one seems to continue with that same idea, deal with things before they happen. And then the second one is a little bit different. Put things in order before there is confusion. So there's another translation of this, again from Red Pine, that basically says, govern before anyone rebels. And here we see that idea of the governing picture being brought more to the fore in how the passage is translated. But I think with the Feng and English translation here, it's a little bit easier to see in a more generic sense, this idea of putting things in order before there's confusion. And this is a little bit different. It's similar, but different than dealing with things while they're still small. And so what's going to happen here is there was 3 statements before this that were dealing with issues while they were small. And there's going to be 3 statements that come after this that have to deal with putting things in order before there's confusion. So we kind of end up with a pattern where there's, let's say, the A section where it's listing 3 different things. In this case, deal with things while they're still small. Brittle things are easily broken and small things are easy to scatter. So then the first solution in those 2 lines is deal with the small. And then we have solution B, which is essentially this idea of planning ahead. And then we're going to see then 3 examples of B. So this is just trying to give you a little bit of a framework for how the text is unfolding. Are you following the pattern that's laid out here? Okay. So then let's look at the 3 plan ahead issues. A tree as great as a man's embrace springs from a small shoot. So here, if we're thinking about keeping things in order before there's confusion, because a tree has the possibility of becoming this large thing, you have to think about where this is going to be planted, right? Because you don't want to have it maybe right next to your house if it's like a redwood or something, because it might end up upsetting the foundation or breaking in through the house or whatever. You have to pay attention again while it's small, but there's also this planning aspect of where should this be, or what are you going to build next to, or whatnot. And then it says a terrace 9 stories high begins with a pile of earth. So again, you have this goal, this vision, this terrace that's going to be 9 stories high. Well, it begins with laying the foundation. And where is that going to happen? And what needs to be in place to actually achieve something like that? So again, putting things in order before there's confusion. And then we come to, which might be one of the most famous lines in all of the Tao Te Ching: a journey of 1,000 miles starts under one's feet. Sometimes it's translated as begins with a first step. And so we have, again, a similar idea here that if you want to start out, there's a beginning, right? There's a place that you're starting from, and you have to be able to think ahead about what that's going to entail. And so there's this planning aspect that's going to become important. And I'm just curious because I had come across this and I have heard this before, but have other people heard this last line as well? 1,000 miles begins with a single step or underneath one's feet.
I remember Splinter saying it in an episode of the Ninja Turtles.
That's amazing.
I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure.
What, the Ninja Turtles?
I think my kids watch something like that, but I don't
They're
think
so
they
cool.
are they?
Yeah. I haven't heard it exactly like this, but of course, you know, you hear things like, yeah, you have to take the first step, you know.
Mm.
I have heard something along the first line where like a tree is most easily uprooted when it's a sprout.
Mm. Yeah, that too. Okay, so we've got then this idea that peace is easily maintained somehow, and then it's going to go through 3 options or 3 things to pay attention to at the beginning, which is there's problems are easy to deal with them while they're still little. And then we go through 3 examples of how planning is easier if you start before things are underway. It's easier to deal with where the tree is, how we build the house, where we're going on our journey if these things are thought through from the beginning. So this would be some aspects then for how that piece is maintained. And we could think of that maybe like that 9-story terrace, right? It's a complicated thing that has a lot of moving parts. And if we want to have it be maintained, then there's a lot of attention that has to be given to the small things and to how things are put together, how they're layered up. So those who act defeat their own purpose. So now we're getting into what are the challenges to the piece. So act here is wei, as in the concept of wu wei that we've talked about previously. And wu wei we were understanding as not acting, but the acting that was taken into consideration had to do with more of these socially derived values or ways of thinking about acting that weren't necessarily based off of, let's say, reality or some type of objective reason. So here we have this idea that somebody's acting and that it's not a wu wei, it's not a spontaneous or natural type of acting. We can take the general Taoist perspective here that wei without wu wei is, for the most part, dealing with following through with those general social ideas about how things are supposed to be done. And so their challenge is that these social constructs that are driving the values and the ways that people are acting because they're not in alignment with Tao is why they're causing problems. So here, someone who's acting according to those commonly accepted social ways of doing things are actually working against themselves, that those who act in that way are defeating their own purpose. And I think it also sheds some light on this with the idea of purpose, that there's a desire or a goal in place here that somebody is working towards, and that can get into where the challenge is. So the Taoists clearly also have a goal, and that goal is that there's peace, that goal is that there's this way of life that is in harmony with the Tao. So they're not saying that there's a way of doing life without goals or purposes or values, but they are wanting to really challenge what is behind those values, to recognize that even for the Taoists, they're always subjective, that they are not objective. They have put forth reasons for why they think that the harmony with the Tao is the right way to go. And ultimately, it's because there's an effectiveness in the sense that things go more smoothly and there's more of the ability for things to flourish. And there's a way for more of the diversity of life to find a place when we let things unfold in more of a natural sense and in harmony with the Tao. Whereas if you are trying to unfold things in a way according to a particular human design, then the problem is that not everything fits. Now you got to start carving the wood to make it fit particular patterns. And it's this resistance to being carved up that is at the root of why there's the social chaos. So there's still an argument that there's a way of doing things, but the Taoists are constantly bringing that to challenge. Like, why are we approaching it this way versus that way? And so here they're saying, if you're maybe more just inherited these social ways of thinking about things, when you act according to those, you actually work against your own purposes. Those who grasp lose. So this idea of holding on to something, again, if we think about that transient or impermanence of yin yang, how things continually transform into other things, that part of where they see that imbalance happening is people holding too tightly to one aspect of things and not allowing things to go through its natural transformations. So there's this stagnant idea of grasping and holding on to something and not wanting something to change. We have to be more flexible and allow that change to happen and embrace that change, because that is the actual natural way that things unfold. So then the flip side of that then would be that the wise do not act. So here we have the Wu Wei, and so are not defeated. The idea is that they are acting from more of the spontaneous or natural way of being, or there's actually that cultivated aspect of natural behavior, but that is assumed that that cultivation is going to be inconsistent with the way of Tao. They do not grasp and therefore do not lose. So they're able to be open to that transformation, open to that change, that continuous evolving of how things happen.
It's reminding me of, I watched this movie one time in, I don't know, high school or middle school, and it was about tornadoes and how, like, if you're caught up in a tornado, like, relax your body as much as you possibly can, because if you fall or you hit something and your muscles are relaxed, you're going to get a lot less hurt than if you tense up and like try to fight it or like, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what this is reminding me of. Like, don't tense up, don't try so hard to act, or like don't squeeze the soap essentially, you know?
Trying
Like
to
just let it
control.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a unfortunate situation that when you see drunk driver accidents, oftentimes it'll be a horrific accident, and the person who was hit will tense and brace for the impact and suffer far more injuries than the person who's really drunk that can't tense up, right? They just kind of, like you said, they're more relaxed, and so they actually suffer less of injuries. So there's definitely something to that idea of how your body is going to respond to things if you're not actively trying to control it or force it or prevent it. Some interesting ideas, I think, probably too, going back to some of those martial arts ideas of how certain things are received or deflected that have to do more with being relaxed than tense, that probably pay into some of that as well. So, continuing, says people usually fail when they are on the verge of success. Now, we can take this as more of a general thing, and I think that also applies. But if we're thinking about it in terms of social governing, this is interesting too, because it's like they got close. They're about to have that success, it says, but then for some reason they're failing. And the advice here is to give as much care to the end as to the beginning. So maybe there's this aspect that there was a lot of concern and a lot of focus, and things got started and they were going well, and somehow they lose that focus. Don't know if it's because maybe it seems like everything's going fine and they're not paying as much attention, or if they get distracted or overconfident. Not sure what that is, but there's definitely this idea that we need to continually be focused on what's actually in front of us and not lose sight of that. And I frequently I'm involved in project management situations, and we can definitely see this, right? Like a lot of the way we look at it is, that 80% of the effort is in the final 20%, right? There's a lot in the end that if it's not paid attention to or managed carefully can really be disastrous. So, and then of course, that's a little bit of the hyperbolic way of talking in the Daodejing that, if you're paying attention to the same degree at the end as you did at the beginning, then there will be no failure. Obviously, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but it's, to kind of make that point. So then we're going to switch over to Red Pine for the final passage here, because I think it captures it a little bit more specifically. So it gets back to, so how do the sages then handle what's happening? And the sage here is the idea of like the sage ruler, the wise ruler of the community. And it says that sages thus seek what no one else seeks. And the reason I like this translation a bit better, and there is more than one that went down this direction, but the more literal translation would be that they desire not to have desires. And that can be very easily misconstrued with more of a, let's say, a Buddhist idea of, trying to get to a point where you don't have desires. And that's not exactly where the Taoists go with this. It's more of the idea that the person who's in a position of rulership needs to not be ruling according to their personal desires, that they need to be in their position for the sake of the community, for the people as a whole, as opposed to seeking after personal interest. So here it says then that this sage ruler thus seeks what no one else seeks. They're seeking the good of the community versus their own personal good. They're looking for, how do we have that harmony and balance with the Tao, as opposed to seeking after my own personal interests. And it says they don't prize hard to get goods. And we saw several chapters dealing with this aspect, that when you have things that are considered of, supreme value, but they are hard to come by, that it creates division, because then people are trying to chase after these things, and those that have versus those that don't create this imbalance in the community that is difficult to deal with. So here again, we can think about a couple chapters back when it says, if somebody is being installed as the emperor, or even the three primary ministers underneath the emperor, that better than being presented with these treasures of jade and these horse-drawn chariots, that it's better to sit and kneel and focus on the Tao. And so here we have a similar idea, that these hard to get goods are only going to create that corruption or that distortion within the community. It's much more important to stay focused on the things that typically seem to get forgotten. And so they study what no one else studies. And again, this is one of those phrases that gets translated awkwardly because it's saying study, not studying in more of a literal sense, right? But it's that idea that they're studying the things that are typically not studied or overlooked. They turn to what others pass by. So a lot of what we've seen with the Tao Te Ching or proposed with this is that it is embracing this earlier indigenous or Paleolithic way of looking at the world that maybe has been forgotten or passed by, and it's resurfacing it and presenting it as a challenge to the current social crisis that they're having at that time as a way to get back to this idea of peace. So what are they doing? They're not chasing after the things that society tells you to chase after. They're not using those personal desires or the positions of power to chase personal desires. And so if we're back to thinking about how is that peace maintained, part of it is not participating in those socially norms, those social norms of, power for control and chasing after wealth. And that would be like the example of way that's going to lead to their own destruction. But instead, they're looking to the things that are normally forgotten, the things that people pass by. And this is going to be returning to understanding the nature of things and getting past these social contrivances and trying to get at what's actually there and dealing with that reality. And then finally, it's saying to help all things remain natural, which is a translation of the phrase Zaran, I think is how it's pronounced. And we've come across this phrase in the past, and it's an interesting phrase. We'll come back to this in just a minute, but it has to do with translating it as natural makes sense. You could also say of itself or self so. There's this idea that things just kind of have a way of doing what they do if they're allowed to just exist as opposed to trying to force it into certain patterns. And so the all things here is actually that 10,000 things. And so we're thinking about all of the different aspects of our world. And this is not just like the other animals or the plants and trees. It also gets into ideas and concepts, all the stuff that makes up the world that we engage with. All of that stuff has a natural aspect to it that when it's allowed to, from the Taoist perspective, flourish according to itself, there's a balance and a harmony to that gets corrupted when we try to control it and make it work in a different way. And the final line is they dare not act. And so again, it's that emphasis on the Wu Wei, not participating in those social norms. So before I go into some final comments, I'll see if you guys have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I feel like it's just diving deeper into the last section. It's just kind of elaborating on it a little bit more.
I'm not sure if it's telling us to be proactive or reactive.
Well, I think it's having us deal with both, right? So if we think about those two opening passages that are lines that are dealing with making sure you pay attention to the details and the small things because it's easier to address things while they're still small. But then in a similar vein, starting with the small when you're thinking about how things are going to progress, this idea of putting things in order is going to be more of a proactive aspect. And if we're thinking about from the perspective of governing and the opening line of this maintaining the peace, then we see more of a Taoist concern about how, from a leadership perspective, is maintaining the conditions under which things can naturally thrive is more of the goal as opposed to somebody having some ideas about what they want to do and how they can shape society in order to reach certain ends that are maybe more of a personal goal rather than what is the general need for people and the environment to actually thrive. So I think it's both. There's reacting, especially while things are first happening, instead of waiting till they become big, and then also thinking ahead because of knowing, that little trees become big trees. So you've got this yin yang transformation, that things don't stay the same. You can't hold on to it and keep the tree little. I mean, obviously there's bonsais and that kind of thing, but this is, in general, that you have to be aware that that transformation is going to happen. And if you haven't taken that into consideration, then your plans are going to fail. If you're trying to keep things unchanging, then it's going to mess up. You have to understand that there's that transformation. That giant tower starts with a little pile of dirt, or that, problems start as little things, but they can become big things. That would be, I think, the general approach that they're trying to take here. All right. Well, let's look at a little bit more at this word zaran. So, of itself or self-so, it's also sometimes translated as spontaneity, in the same way that we see this idea of wu wei. But it is interesting because for the Taoist, nature becomes then the exemplar of what people should be looking at in terms of how things act and react. So I frequently will bring up the example of, they'll look at the forest and all the stuff is happening in the forest without anybody controlling it or conducting it or anything along those lines. All the different things just seem to do what they naturally do, and they fit together in this harmonious way, including the seasons and everything else. And their thought is that humans are part of that whole thing. One of the maybe big divides between East and West in terms of philosophically thinking is that on the West, there was much more of an insistence that humans are separate from nature, that there's something unique about humans that's different, because if humans were just part of nature, everything in nature is more of this cause and effect, and they somehow sought to show that humans function differently than that. So here, there's much more of a expectation that we are just a part of this whole. We're not something in that sense special, that we are not like everything else, but that we are actually just like everything else. And so if we're going to truly be able to thrive, then there needs to be this naturalness that is allowed to happen, that they're shooting for, and what that model is that they're trying to achieve. And so this is where, from the sage perspective, ensuring that everything has its ability to just be of itself is becoming key to how they're approaching this idea of governing, or this idea of how is peace maintained, which it's almost kind of like the difference between harmony and conformity. Whereas conformity says everything will be fine and everything will be at peace if everybody just becomes just like this, right? And this is like the idea of the carved wood. If we shape everything and make everything fit and conform to the pattern that we've envisioned, then everything will be fine. As opposed to this idea of harmony, where the differences aren't problems, they become benefits, in the sense of how do these things weave together in such a way that they complement each other and help each other have something greater than the whole because of the differences, as opposed to trying to eliminate the differences and make everything the same. I think this might be at that core of where they're seeing this idea of Zaran and government and the naturalness of things versus the way, the WEI, that contrivance, that social way of trying to organize things. It's an interesting contrast, and I think there's a lot that we maybe get concerned about, because we feel like if everything is kind of left to itself, that it's going to turn out really badly. And it's a legitimate concern. But I wonder how much of this is a concern that's shaped in us from the larger social construct because it's justifying its existence. Basically, the powers on high saying, without us, it would be chaos. It would be Mad Max. You need us to bring that order and stability to the world because otherwise everything would be utter disaster. And the Taoists are saying, maybe not. Maybe, the way it was before, there were all these hierarchies. Humans did just fine in the world. And maybe, we are just like everything else. And it seems to know how to get along and function in the world without having to have that kind of controlling hierarchy. And I think there's probably something to that. I do think that the current state of affairs, where we have scaled to such an extreme, creates some real challenges for that. But maybe we're seeing the deficits of trying to scale too big as well. So just a final quote, because we're coming up at time here. An interesting passage from Mencius that kind of illustrates the distinction of the two different perspectives. He's talking about that man from Feng who worried that his rice shoots weren't growing fast enough. And so he went around pulling at them. At the end of the day, he returned home exhausted and said to his family, I am worn out. I've been helping the rice grow. His son ran out to look and found the fields all withered and dying.
Wow.
And I think that is a really good illustration of the differences between the two approaches, right? That we can't just let it happen naturally, that somehow we've got to intervene and we've got to do something to help it grow. But in doing so, we've actually destroyed it.
Is this, so I see you've got some names down there. Is this from a different book or?
Yes. So Mencius is another Warring States author. He's more in the Confucian line of thinking. But he's definitely one of the voices from that period that has stood the test of time and is still around. You can get copies of the book. And Hinton there is the translator. So Mencius and then the 2a.2 is the reference for where you can find it in Mencius, and then Hinton is the particular translation I used. I like this chapter. It gives, at least for a lot of the things that appeal to me in terms of thinking about community and how do you evolve a community, there was a lot in this one that I found really challenging and good to think about.
Do you have any other thoughts that weren't in your presentation about this? Like, how are you thinking about this, I guess?
I would say that, I mean, some of you know more of my history, that I used to actually be a pastor, and then I came out of that and embraced more of a naturalistic philosophy. And so I've had an ongoing question about, the idea of community, or even this idea of spirituality, I think still has an important place, even within more of a secular worldview. And so the questions are, what does that look like? And how would this come together? And in what sense would this be something that people would actually need? Right. So a lot of people go to church or different types of religious organizations because it provides them with certain things. But if you take away this idea that there's some type of divine mandate from on high that's saying this is the right way and this is what you should follow and you need to worship me, there's a lot of what happens in that community around those aspects. But if you take that part away and come back with more of a naturalist approach to life, there's still, I think, a need within the human psyche for community and this experience of spirituality, even if we're not talking about it in a supernatural sense. And the questions for me are, what does that look like? And how might this kind of a community come to exist? Or what purpose is it going to serve in the larger community in terms of helping to move towards, greater benefit for everybody? So if we're talking about, again, more of my social justice kind of thinking about how does life become a blessing for everybody instead of just for a few at the top, And that's kind of the different angles that I look at in terms of taking this information and putting it into practical use in a modern context.
Yeah, I always like, I know we review it in the context of the Warring States period, but I'm always trying to translate like how I can apply this, like what can I learn from this,
Yeah.
um, and use it, on my day-to-day life. And of course, it's easier said than done because it's a means of practice in these things, right? Like you can't just have this 1 hour every week and then absorb everything and just apply it, done. um, so I always try to relate it back, and I like that it comes back to subjects every now and then. Like it kind of retouches on some things because it helps refresh the practice. Like, oh yeah, I should be keeping this in mind as often as I can. Um, and yeah, I like a lot of the things that it makes me think about, and the frequency in which it makes me think about them.
Yeah.
It
And
definitely
there's
helps with that.
definitely the personal aspects of it too that absolutely I feel like I benefit from. And that's part of where I am motivated to find ways to be able to share this more broadly and maybe take it to that next step where it's not just, individuals trying to wrestle with this on their own, but how can we maybe bring this together into more of a community that has ways to help in terms of not just learning things, but there's benefit in community with things like accountability, and also in terms of having larger projects to focus on. So there's no shortage of the problems that we have to face in our world today. And I think there's a few key things that have big impact. I like things where by tweaking one lever, you impact 10 different things. And so those are the areas that I'm trying to focus on. Yeah. But I'll keep you posted as things develop in that direction, if they develop in that direction. But that's where some of my leaning goes and why something like this chapter really appealed to me. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And if you are interested in being a part of our live Zoom discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email each week with our latest video as well as the link for this conversation. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area, directions to where we meet in person. All right. We'll see you guys next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.